hardly 60 days to the election. So it is indeed a major countdown. And for that reason, we decided that today's session will bring all of us, the regular commentators on this matter, together so that we pick what we consider to be some of the key issues as we move ever closer to the material day, which is November 3rd. And therefore, we have a full cast of 5 colleagues and myself moderating. And so we'll just go through the session with the colleagues chiming in with their perspectives. If you have any questions or comment, you can always post that in the box entitled Q&A or the chat box, and we'll have the speakers respond to some of the issues that you raise. And so without further ado, having explained that today's session is more general, we will actually kick off. And I just want to use the screen as my guideline here. And therefore on my screen, I see Professor Gilbert Khadiagala as the first person.
Well, I thought we agreed yesterday.
Okay, I think Gilbert has nothing to say for now, so we'll invite Brooks with your perspective.
All right, should I go ahead now?
Sure, you proceed, yeah.
Okay. I'm glad we're doing this event today because traditionally in America, the first Monday in September is Labor Day. It would have been May Day, but there were reasons within the American political history that it isn't. But Labor Day is usually the kickoff for the actual campaign. People begin to feel, aha, it really is upon us. There are just a couple of months left. The speeches begin to grow in intensity. The debates begin to show up very quickly. And people who up until that moment have been paying very little attention to the campaign. You may not think that's true, but there are millions upon millions of people who have been paying attention to all kinds of other things and not this. Although the people who are talking today have been focused on this for months and months and months. But Labor Day then becomes the kickoff for the more general understanding and appreciation for the election. Now, a very brief word on this presidential election. We should keep in mind that in the picking of the president, it's not the popular vote that counts. It's as if there are 51 state and District of Columbia elections. You win a state, you gain all of its electoral weight, and that's how you win the election. But in addition to the presidency, there are thousands of other offices that are also being picked by voters, including a third of the Senate and the full complement of the House of Representatives, dozens of governors, mayors, state legislators, on and on and on. So it becomes a referendum, not just on 2 people, but the entire country. I tried to pick the big benchmarks for me. And the first of these is what I call the big gaffe. And we don't know what a big gaffe is until it happens. But when either of the candidates says or does something that is so egregious, that begins to change the direction and the tenor of the electoral campaign and the election itself. And the biggest gaffe I can think of is the 1981, in the midst of one of the presidential debates, Gerald Ford, 1976, excuse me. Gerald Ford said, Poland has never been dominated by the Soviet Union. Now, he didn't mean what he said in the way he said it, but Democrats jumped on it, and it confirmed in the popular mind that Gerald Ford was something of a 20-watt bulb in a 150-watt socket. And that may well have decided his chances. The next thing to keep in mind, we are nowhere near completion of the cycle. There are 4 presidential and vice presidential debates yet to come. First is a presidential debate at the end of the month, and then the other 3 are spaced out that way till the end of October. Any one of those debates could, of course, do something that either elevates or denigrates one of the 2 candidates in ways we do not yet know. Then the next thing I want to just toss out here is the October surprise, and that's a colloquial expression that means that one or another of the candidates could well do something right at the end of the campaigning that is unexpected, is unanticipated, and yet it changes the very tenor of the way the campaign is fought and the contents of it. The next thing is what I call the unique hat trick. Right now, you have the pandemic that's not being brought under control. You have the economy, which is still limping badly. You have the ongoing, what we'll have to use for shorthand purposes, call racial tumult. And those 3 things together should, under normal circumstances, be almost a death blow to an incumbent president. Think back to 1932. Now, I wasn't around for that. Maybe one of the other panelists was. But 1932, in the midst of the Depression, the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover was running for re-election, and the economic collapse was sufficient to absolutely destroy his re-election chances, even though Franklin Roosevelt was unproven material for many people. The next 2 things are closely related, what we'll call the exogenous impact. That's what is Russia or Russian efforts or people working on behalf of Russia doing in terms of affecting communication in the campaign space, affecting the way in which information is being sent out. Then the endogenous impact, supposing there is a new scandal that breaks out, a video arrives which proves beyond a shadow of a doubt one of the other candidates has committed some unpardonable sin beyond all those things that Donald Trump has already done. And the final thing, and I think I'm just about ready to bump into my 5-minute mark, yes, Bob? Is, and I think other people will speak to this more deeply, the deep divides in the country along the questions of race, along the questions of this division between Black Lives Matter and the right-wing militia groups and all of these other things. They seem to be lining up together in parallel in a way which heightens the differences between the 2 parties and thus between the 2 candidates. Bring us all together. I can't give you a prediction yet of who's going to win until we get a little more information about each of those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, each of those 7 big things that I've just laid out. And at that, I'll close it off for you, Bob, and you can give it to the next person.
Thank you, Brooks. And I think one of the key points that I've taken from this is your very apt reminder that this is not just presidential elections, that the elections at very many other levels, and sometimes we forget that. And perhaps we can now, come back to that point later. But for now, I'd like to invite Dr. Michelle Small to come in and share her perspectives. Welcome, Dr. Michelle.
Bob. Yeah, so what are the pertinent and pressing issues for this 2020 election, and what are the implications of those? There are many. There are many pertinent and pressing ones, but the one that I believe will define this election, and quite possibly the election to come thereafter, is that of violence. Violence doesn't stand apart from all the other issues that we've been thrashing out in these sessions. It's deeply interconnected to and a product of presidential abuses of power, of the design of the electoral system, so voter suppression, of structural racial inequality, this ethnic nationalism that we see of the alt-right, and the steady erosion in legitimacy and integrity of government institutions, ranging from the Federal Electoral Commission to the police force. From an African viewpoint, the story playing out in the US is all too familiar. Here stands a demagogue whose electoral victory and mainstay of power relies on appealing to base identity politics, who governs by divide and rule, who dishes out state resources and jobs to friends and family, and who resorts to inciting violence when things don't go his way, or for things to go his way. This is not the story of Alassane Ouattara in Côte d'Ivoire, or Pierre Nkurunziza in Burundi, or Francois Bozize in Central African Republic. This is the story of Donald Trump in the United States of America. In 2016, in the aftermath of Trump's electoral victory, protests erupted in many cities across the US, some turning to riots, specifically in Portland, Oregon, and Oakland, California. And this was characterized by the burning of car tires, the smashing of windows, throwing of projectiles, and arson, with rioters chanting, "We reject the president-elect." In certain places, these riots went on for 3 nights before they were disbanded by law and order. Officers threw flashbang devices, rubber bullets, and tear gas. Anywhere else in the world, and especially in Africa, this would be called post-election violence. The violence that we are seeing unfold in battleground cities across the US today is not random. It's not haphazard. There is an underpinning fault line that has been seized upon. The violence is born out of the politicization of race in the run-up to and since Trump's presidential win. Trump, as we know, rose to power based on the alt-right power, white fear, and supremacist support. And we all remember the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where Trump failed to denounce white supremacist violence. The violence we are watching unfold today is fomented violence at the most elite level, that of incumbent President Trump. The 2018 study that draws its data from FBI reporting statistics noted that there was an anomalous 13% uptick in hate crimes in the period 2015 to 2016 that coincides with Trump's political campaign and becoming president. This is the second highest rise in hate crimes since 2002, whereby in the aftermath of 9/11, there was a 21% uptick in hate crimes rooted in Islamophobia. Interesting, the surge in hate crimes occurred in the fourth quarter of 2016, the period closest to the election. The divisive and explosive racist anti-immigrant rhetoric of Trump has ranged from, as we know, the false birtherism charges against US's first Black president, Barack Obama, to nativist barring of Muslims entering the country, labeling Mexican immigrants rapists and criminals, labeling Haiti and African countries. And Bob, guide me here. I don't know if I should edit myself on something whole countries. And setting this against wishing more people would come to the US from the blonde-haired, blue-eyed country of Norway. Recently, Trump encouraged his supporter bases to go around and watch other polling places. He also recently said, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. This is what the incitement of violence looks like at the elite level. So, this has politely been described as some saying that Trump is stirring the pot, but by others, this looks like chaos and division as a political strategy. And there is some emerging evidence in this regard. In the past 4 years, there's been an increase in those who commit hate crimes directly citing Trump when carrying out their acts. And this has been touted the Trump effect. Most significantly, and what we have seen, there's been an uptick in racialized police violence that has led to mass demonstrations around the country. Between May and August of this year, ACLED, which stands for the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, it's essentially a crisis mapping tool, recorded 10,600 protest events in the country. 95% of these have been peaceful. But the brutal and unjust deaths of Black men and women at the hands of police officers instilling this law and order has led to violent flashpoints and interactional violence between protesters, police, and white nationalists across the US. And we know of these cases: Freddie Gray, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, Sylville Smith, George Floyd, Jacob Blake, Breonna Taylor, the list goes on. Of civilians killed by police in 2020, 28% have been Black, despite Black people only making up 13% of the population. Racist police brutality is institutionalized, and it's revealing of this wider and deep structural inequality that exists in America. And this is what President Trump has built his power base on, what he appeals to and what he stokes. In the protests that have turned riots, we've seen this interactional violence between one side variously labeled activists, anarchists, radicals, versus pro-Trump supporters, the alt-right, white supremacist militias in cities like Kenosha, Minneapolis, Georgia, where the deployment of the National Guard occurred, Atlanta, Detroit, the list goes on. And it's been met with an increasingly militarized response by law enforcement agents. There's been the deployment of over 55 federal and National Guard forces across the country, using increasingly militarized tactics. But what's also interesting in this pattern is the rise of non-state actors, variously referred to as militias or vigilante groups. Again, we can return to the key data here. You have the rise of groups such as Antifa, New Mexico Civil Guard, Patriot Front, Proud Boys, Boogaloo Boys, Virginia Knights, Three Percenters, and many more who are playing an organizational role in this violence. These groups, these non-state violence actors, have been linked to over 100 events this summer alone. So for me, let's call what we are seeing what it is. We are witnessing election violence in one of the most established democracies in the world, the United States of America. What are the implications of this violence? It has significant ramifications for the US, Africa, and beyond. First, for the US, I've jotted 5 main things. The first is that you have an incumbent president of the United States using violence as a tool to foment his supporter base and to leverage political power. In addition to all the other electoral irregularities he's been accused of, what it also shows is that institutions in the US are not as strong as assumed. They are not viewed as adequate, reliable, fair, or effective sites for airing, resolving, and settling inequalities and disputes. 2, related to this, voters are taking to the streets. Voters are taking on each other to contest their differences. And this could spell a dangerous normalization of violence during electoral cycles, or even just during civil life. 3, there's a cautionary tale to be told here of election violence, as we've seen on the African continent. It does not always result in the intended outcome. The riots and violence rooted in racial, social, economic, political injustice may ironically give Trump his win. Suburbanite voters may turn away from the seemingly destabilizing mob violence and towards the law and order that Trump generically espouses. 4th, if the violence goes unchecked, if it continues to be stoked, fanned by Trump, and Trump refuses to accept an electoral loss, post-election retaliatory violence could unfold. Or, if Trump wins, we could witness demonstrations of discontent that turn violent, as witnessed in 2016 following his win. And 5th, the electoral system needs attention. And I turn to my esteemed colleagues here to give us more detail on the intricacies of this, but racism is deeply embedded within the electoral system. Black voters have faced disenfranchisement and suppression, historically based on literacy or the payment of a poll tax, to that today, such as felony disenfranchisement, the closure of polling stations in low voting areas, or lacking the proper identification to vote. What does this mean for Africa? Two things. The first, unchecked election violence in the US emboldens incumbent electoral autocrats and demagogues in Africa and elsewhere. In countries where manipulation, abuse of power, rigging, intimidation, and violence have been resorted to, they will persist. External leverage discouraging abuses of power and violence must be rooted in example and best practice. And this could feed into further democratic reversals on the continent. Two, and this is a big or this could be the great moment for African agency. African Democrats need to speak out and call out the abuses of power and violence being witnessed in this American election. African leaders now need to hold America to account for this very same deviations, manipulations, irregularities, and violence that the continent itself has been called out for. And the final point, what implications does this hold beyond this 2020 election? The risk factors and causes of election violence don't simply go away. Outside of the electoral cycle, a negative peace may result, but the long and deep fractures that caused the grievance, division, and hatred need to be addressed, or else those fault lines will lay dormant until stoked or fomented by expedient individuals hungry for political power. And with that, Bob, I turn back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Small. I think you touched on some very, very interesting points, all centered on pre and post election violence, which are the kinds of terms and words we use mostly for Africa, but now being used with regards, as you rightly point out, to one of the more established democracies, in fact, a leading democracy, as it were. But I think at this point, let's turn it over to Professor John Stremlau to also share his perspective. Welcome, Prof.
Well, thanks, Bob, and thank you very much, Michelle. I'm tempted for those who may be watching the video of this session to push the skip button for my presentation, because I thought Michelle did a wonderful job of identifying what really is a core issue and an issue of great concern in Africa. And in a sense, my general remarks that I had planned will, in a sense, give a perhaps broader context to the much more focused approach that Dr. Small just gave. My question that I posed to myself was, is this an inflection point for the United States in its democratic development? And if so, does this have implications for Africa? Now, what do we mean by inflection point? It's bending the curve, and I have to think of the curve as the one that Martin Luther King liked to describe as a long arc of history bending toward justice. And at this inflection point, in my view, it could bend either toward justice or, as Michelle was alluding to, the risk of bending away from justice. Now, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have both talked about the 2020 election as an inflection point, and Obama did too at the convention, although not as explicitly as they did. Trump doesn't use the term, but clearly believes the 2020 election vote for him personally is an inflection point. Everything turns on his success for him. And GOP seems that his party, the Republican Party, appears to think that their state capture chances are greatly enhanced if, in fact, he is able to leverage the overrepresentation of the red states and to pull off a second electoral college victory, which has with it the Senate disproportionate power if the Senate stays with a Republican majority, and then they have control over judicial appointments. That's still a bit of a stretch for him because he does not think that he can get the popular vote, and his campaign manager, Bill Sepien, said as much to Politico last week, but he can have a shot at the electoral college vote. So does this matter for Africa if it's in fact an inflection point? Well, Michelle has certainly given reasons why it should with regard to the violence dimension. I give 5 quick points. One, I'd like to point out is the question of racial justice, and she's alluded to that as well, which is always of interest across Africa. Black Lives Matter statements were issued and demonstrations did occur. This is a domestic problem for the United States, but it's a domestic problem that governments have seemed to concluded the norms of today allow them to speak out for and speak out on. And so that's an interesting way into the more interdependent politically world we live in that Michelle was alluding to. The election of Biden and Harris would bend the arc, but it would not bend the arc decisively because structural racism does run so deep into the body politic and the bloodstream of America going back 400 years that even his liberal supporters today tacitly support de facto segregation in blue northern states where property values, education access, healthcare access, employment are all subject to what is implicitly called a racial contract that Francis may well reference and certainly can expand upon. But Biden and Harris, I believe, and after the effects of the triple pandemics that Brooks Spector alluded to, will certainly help bend the arc toward racial justice and inclusion, bringing closer to the South African ideal of a country that belongs to all who live in it. The triple COVID pandemic and economic crisis and the Black Lives Matter makes this election unlike any that I've ever lived through. The second point after racial justice is this election is a test between those supporting an American identity defined by ethnic nationalism versus those who identify as civic nationalists. Obama mentioned democracy 18 times in his 20-minute endorsement of Biden at the convention of the Democrats, but Trump didn't use the term once, democracy once, in his 70-minute GOP acceptance speech. This is a question of whether or not you can have an institutional strength that works. The third point that I'd like to raise is that a related reason is that, and I'm blending this to the second one, when Obama came to Ghana in 2009, as you will all remember, he said what Africa needs is not strong men, but strong institutions. Now he is confronting, and we all confronting, the question of strong men or strong institutions in the US context, which makes a nice bridge to the African familiarity. And I won't belabor that about the way that Trump exemplifies some of the autocratic tendencies that we've seen and become accustomed to and want to see ending in Africa. Trump may be a weak strong man, but he certainly exhibits all of the attributes of the demagogue populist leader, as Brooks has noted, in his words and his actions and those of his cronies. And the state capture risks are also an inflection point that will be recognized by those of us who live in this continent. The fourth point is that in foreign relations, and to an extent in foreign policy, which is not the same thing, that's much broader, the US is at an inflection point. Trump's nationalist unilateralism versus Biden's democratic multilateralism is really very, very important distinction that will matter a lot to Africans. Lots of actions on matters related to Africa, such as the WHO and the GATT WTO, climate change, immigration, security, non-state actors, and most immediately vaccination nationalism, are all programs that will of interest of Africa if Biden and Harris are elected, and they won't be, and the US won't be a player if we have a second Trump administration. I know that programs such as PEPFAR and Feed the Future and Power Africa and the Young Leaders Initiative, YALI, even AGOA, though vulnerable to Trump's budget cuts and his capriciousness, they still enjoy bipartisan congressional support. So when Professor Khadiagala talks about the continuity in US programming and activities and policies perhaps toward Africa, he's got a point, but we are at an inflection point, I believe, on this question of Trump's national unilateralism and Biden's democratic multilateralism. The final point, and which Michelle dwelt on at some length, is electoral integrity and the possibility that Trump will attempt to steal this election. There are lots of scenarios and lots of warnings. David Brooks in the New York Times this morning had a column. And if he is successful, that really will be a negative inflection point, bending the arc for a long time away from greater justice, because you cannot have a credible, sustainable democracy if you don't have credible elections. And with that, I will end and just note that the foreign interference in this electoral process by Russia and others has ignited a lot of discussion and debate that I think this project should pay attention to with regard to social media and the recent Facebook response. So on that, I'll pass it on to Francis.
Okay.
Okay, sure.
Okay, should I go ahead?
Yeah, Francis, welcome, and it's your turn. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well. Okay. Well, what I'm going to try to do is to contextualize what we've been discussing in giving something of a historical and contemporary context in defining U.S. election 2020 as a civil war moment. And I call this, as we analyze the balance of forces, I call this Civil War II. Now, if Civil War I in the mid-19th century was a North-South military confrontation about secession over whether or not slavery would be allowed expansion, Civil War II is what I would call a low-grade intensity confrontation resulting from unresolved post-emancipation racial issues from Civil War I. Because all of these developments that we've been witnessing are part of a historical continuum that roots back to the 19th century. And this is regarding whether or not the United States will actually remain a democracy, imperfect as it is, or succumb to an era of what I would call racial fascism and accelerated relative decline as the premier global superpower. And if a Joe Biden, Kamala Harris victory is the outcome, the sustainability of American democracy will still remain in question, pending Democratic control of both houses of Congress, which is not a certainty, accompanied by a movement of systemic democracy reform that rebalances the balance of forces into a level playing field, which is not currently the case. Whereas if Trump is elected, then a concerted national democracy movement of systemic reform will actually by default become the only option in a struggle that will have to be waged against a far-right autocratic regime of racial fascism. And this struggle will have to reflect an interactively a duality between the Black activist revival, which is already evident, and interacting with a broader multiracial, multicultural progressive resistance, which means that it means that the U.S. will enter a period of indeterminate instability internally and isolation internationally. And now this does have some implication in terms of Africa, in terms of whether we're looking at Trump being reelected or Biden reelected. And recently, I think we have two specific developments that are pertinent to this. One is the fact that the Trump administration has halted or suspended aid to Ethiopia on the issue of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and this in fact is taking Egypt's side in this dispute over the dam, and related to that is the predicament that Sudan is in now on the issue of normalizing relations with Israel. And what this does is that this highlights the alignment that Trump has nurtured with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, and the fact that Egypt, UAE, Saudi Arabia are backing the military side of the Sudan transitional government, which is now in a very weak position. So that if Trump is reelected, that will further reinforce that alignment. Whereas if Biden and Harris are elected, there is a prospect, hopefully, that the Democratic civilian side of the Sudanese transition will be strengthened. So even though these, I mean, this is how the outcome of the election can have a very specific policy impact as far as Africa is concerned. But overall, in terms of foreign policy, the U.S. will simply become more isolated as the focus of preoccupations in U.S. politics and policy will be this internal battle that is underway surrounding this election, in terms of the fascist threat that we're looking at, and the democratic movement that is that is incipient. So I think I'll end it there, and then we can take it up in further discussion.
Certainly, and thanks for that foreign policy, international relations perspective. I'd like now to invite Professor Gilbert Khadiagala to see if we can contribute to the discussion at this point.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much for those presentations, and very, very insightful. Michelle's, I think, a good area of research, electoral violence in the US and comparative perspectives. I think that's really a good area of research. What I wanted to do was to actually ask you to respond to something that I think is critical this week. There was a CNN poll that reported that Trump is very popular in Nigeria and Kenya. And this is very consistent actually with other polls that were done. In fact, previously the Pew poll a few years ago. So I just wanted you to react, because what I did when I reacted to, somebody asked me about it, and my response was, one, the simple explanation is big man politics. Maybe he's popular because this country, a lot of people in these countries are really very fascinated with big men. So that's one explanation. But I think the more fundamental explanation is that there is a large Kenyan and large Nigerian diaspora in the United States. And this diaspora is always sending money back home. So there is that warmth broadly to the United States. So when somebody asks a poll, when somebody asks this individual whether they think what they think about Trump, very predictably, because of those diaspora linkages, the temptation is really to say, no, I think Trump is doing a good job. But it raises, therefore, to me, a very fundamental question that probably most of these people who are polled about do you like Trump or not in places like Kenya or Nigeria don't really care too much about who is US president. They really care about their people in the US. They care about what they derive from these social cultural relationships. And this to me is very critical because we've been having this debate as to whether in fact a change in the White House makes significant change on the ground. And I'm using this example actually to reinforce, John, to reinforce my point about continuity and about the very fact that the bulk of Africans, and I'm not just saying Nigerians or Kenyans, I think if you did a similar poll across many other countries in Africa, they'll be very consistent with that idea that, you know, people are just gung-ho about the United States. If it's Trump, if it's Biden, it doesn't really matter as long as I'm getting my check every month from my sister who lives in Minnesota. So I wanted to bring that fact in the discussion so that we re-anchor back to the discussions on what does the US mean for Africa. But I really very much appreciate the presentations that you put across, and I thought this would be a good way to get the discussions going. And thank you very much, Bob.
Sure. I think thanks. We'll cycle back again, I think, starting with Brooks and moving all the way to Francis on just this particular question that Professor Khadiagala has posed. You know, the assumption is that we all think Trump is not a very good person, in fact, and that we wish him major loss. But then there are these polls that kind of indicate something else. So let's just take, you know, let's have your perspectives on this. And it's fine if you don't have a perspective, but let's start with Brooks. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It's an interesting question. Do American presidents or politicians or American celebrities, for that matter, what kind of popularity or respect do they gain outside the borders of the United States? I'm sure it's true that in Kenya and Nigeria, some of the reasons for this relate to the transactional nature of money back home, but certainly in recent Pew attitude surveys, I couldn't find the most recent one just a minute ago. I was looking. There are a number of other countries where up until very recently, Donald Trump's positives were quite high, and it's not surprising which ones they are. And they include places like Russia, and they include Israel, and there were one or two places, and I think India as well. Russia, you can explain very easily because of the way in which he has treated with the Russian leader or embraced, in some cases, Russian positions. Israel has something of the same tenor, although I would add a footnote that since 1932, Jewish Americans have not supported Republican candidates, and there's no particular reason now to assume that they will support Donald Trump outside of the normal process. India, you can visualize that largely as a function of India's growing competitiveness, not quite an antagonism, but certainly a competition with China. And to the extent to which Donald Trump excoriates China is the extent to which Indians embrace that as a possible selling point. Also, not to be excluded is a large and increasingly well-off and professional class of South Asian Americans in the United States. Kamala Harris's mother, not excluding that. But I think the very nature of an American president for many people abroad, outside the United States, is a function of celebrity. It's a function of, are they in the news? Are they seen doing things? Are they seen doing things that appear to be, if not good, at least active? And Donald Trump certainly is seen as active, although not by my lights or measuring sticks, good. And I think one of the problems for American analysts of foreign attitudes about American presidents is in trying to separate their own ideas about what constitutes the measure of success or goodness or appropriateness of a president or a leading figure from what other people of other countries and their mindsets, how they get there, how they get to their presumption. It's one of the reasons why I'm constantly asking friends and neighbors and associates and my wife's relatives, what do you think of Donald Trump? And, I sort of cower and wait for the response. And sometimes it's surprisingly positive. People who show up in my house to fix things, their response sometimes is more positive than I would have anticipated. And that really is I think really is a function of the image he's managed to portray over time. And I think we have to separate that from whether or not his policies are useful or effective or even promoting the general welfare of the US or the rest of the world. Let me leave it there.
Thank you, Brooks. And as you are speaking, one of the points that occurred to me is, and for those who are who analyze media, you look at Trump's Twitter account, and it's the single largest in terms of followings. I mean, the people who follow Trump, it runs into millions, and those who are familiar with social media will tell you that raising even just 100 followers is work. You have to be doing some great stuff for you to have those followers. But if you look on websites such as Tweetplomacy, you'll see that Trump averages hits of millions in a day, and that might be also an interesting factor to consider. Let's now have Dr.
Sorry,
Small,
Bob, let me just answer that for a second. He's got about 68, 70 million followers of his Twitter account, and many of those people are American, obviously, but not all of them.
Right. Yeah, so I think it promotes the image factor is worth considering, but let's have Dr. Small also on the same issue.
Thanks, Bob. And Gilbert, you always give us tricky questions, which sometimes defy logic. Why do people believe the things they believe? But that there's a competing poll. If you look at Afrobarometer, they ran a study on what Africans think of democracy in their countries, and they ran it, I think it was across 48 type of political regimes across 48 states in Africa.
Audio was on again.
And the findings were quite interesting. In countries where you've had democratic renewals, democratic reversals, democratic renewals, democratic reversals, much like Kenya and Nigeria, which have experienced, widespread electoral irregularities, rigging, manipulation, violence, you name it, they've had it. But then they've also experienced peace. And the finding was that there is more complacency within democratic regimes in Africa about how they view democracy. So even within a democracy, there was a complacency that democracy wasn't delivering. There was that view that democracy wasn't delivering. And I think it speaks to what you raised as a continuity in US relations. It's this view, as long as goods and services continue to be rendered, the political regime within these states doesn't really matter. And it's a very odd thing to arrive at following that 1990 moment of hope. And then, you know, on the second point is that when you're looking at, you know, why is Trump particularly so popular? I think you're quite correct. This notion of a strong man who gets things done. When I talk about violence in the US, it is really violence light. It is nothing like some of the violence that we've seen in African states. You know, there's no genocide, hopefully there never will be yet. No large-scale deaths, hopefully will not be. And so, you know, there's this probably not this academic appreciation of the dynamics of manipulation and violence, which are important to us as scholars, but for the everyday observer, they wouldn't count what we see as election violence. So yeah, so that's my view on that.
Thanks. And so let's have Professor Stremlau also on the same point of this inexplicable popularity of Trump in some African countries. And I think the South Africans haven't been polled, but Brooks kind of suggests that that might also be the case even here. So John.
Well, Bob, we all know that Barack Obama was very popular in countries too, and Gilbert is certainly right that East Africa and West Africa provide the overwhelming proportion of African immigrants to the United States. And the African immigrant population in the United States is the fastest growing population. But it started at a very low base in 1980 with less than 1 million. And now is perhaps, I don't know exactly, we've got a census underway now, but maybe 5 or 6 million. And this is a country of 330 million. I'd like to think that Francis is right about the Second Civil War, only because I think the issues are fundamental, as I tried to allude to. But how politicized are Americans and the majority of Americans on these issues in the ways that we think they probably should be? And that's a big question mark in my mind. Let me just add, with regard to the attitudes of foreign leaders that Gilbert attended to, you know, people in the United States pay very little attention to foreign affairs, and I find it intriguing. And I always like the figure, which may be apocryphal, that there are more Nigerian doctors in Chicago than there are in Lagos. But and certainly the Nigerian population in the United States is the best educated, among the best educated ethnic groups from abroad that there is. That tells you more about Nigeria perhaps than about America. But in any case, the way we're going forward right now is that this is Biden's election to lose, and I don't want to lose sight of that fact. The polls have been very stable. The polarization of the country is quite deep and baked in. Therefore, we're going to see, and this gets back to Brooks's horse race, you're going to see a lot of intense competition for those swing states in the Midwest. But that assumes, by the part of the Biden campaign, that he could hold on to the other states, which he did in 2016. And that's an assumption that you cannot make in light of the current attitudinal changes that have occurred during his regime. He's never been popular over 40-odd% within the body politic of America. So we're looking at a current projection, which, if you look at the combined polls of The Economist, have Biden-Harris winning 88% certainty, and even 538, which actually did pretty well in anticipating the uncertainties in the 2016 election. Their compilation of polls has it 69%. That does not take away from the fact that this is an inflection election, in my view, but it really is fundamental in how it deals with questions of diversity, which is the African immigrant population issue. I think that Nigerians and Kenyans should be a lot more nervous about a Trump re-election than the polling that Gilbert referred to, just simply because Trump is what Trump is, and he has been consistent throughout his life in his narcissism and in his racism and his discrimination. It goes back years and years and years. And so it will not be good for Africa if Trump gets reelected, obviously. Whether in 4 more years Nigerians finally turn the corner on Trump, I don't know. But at the moment, I don't put much stock into those numbers.
All right, thanks, John. And I think, in fact, Francis has weighed in on this matter in a previous communication with myself. So, Francis, this issue of the polls.
Well, you know, I'm not surprised, really, and I think one of the things that this reflects in one way is the complexity, the increasingly complex nature of what we call Black America. Black America is becoming more and more diverse. There was once upon a time, particularly going into the period of the civil rights movement during the 60s and 70s, you did have tensions between African Americans of Caribbean, West Indian descent and African Americans of historical mainland descent, and that was something of a kind of a low-level dynamic. Now, however, the African immigrant dimension has added more complexity, mainly because, you know, immigrants generally tend to differentiate themselves from, you know, from indigenous native, you know, populations, and you know, it raises a lot of questions about how African Americans of immigrant descent, Nigerian or Kenyan or whatever, actually identify with the mainstream, you know, black movements. They may not want to be considered to be African American or Negro or whatever. They say, oh no, I'm not like you know, I'm not like those people. There is so this adds quite a bit of complexity. I don't, however, think that there's any real you know, it makes any real difference to many of them whether the president is Democrat or Republican, Trump or Biden. If Biden wins the election, Nigerians and Kenyans, I'm sure, will be you know, equally favorable to the Biden regime. I mean, the thing is that everything is very pragmatic and transactional in terms of the way people, particularly of immigrant descent, really look at American politics and, you know, who's in the forefront and so forth. I mean, people just tend to go with the winner, and you know, and the fact that the other problem is that you don't really have an active African affairs constituency in the United States the way you used to have during the anti-apartheid period. Once you had the democratic transition in South Africa, basically the African affairs constituency pretty much evaporated, and now it can be revived, and it should be. Otherwise, what we're going to see is something more akin to the continuity that Gilbert talks about. But you have to, if Africa is really going to benefit from a Biden administration, there's going to have to be a new, more imaginative crafting of Africa policy. There's going to have to be a focus on the AU's Agenda 2063. I haven't heard anyone in the African policy community talk about Agenda 2063, and to some extent, this is how Africa in agency ought to try to influence U.S. policy towards Africa, because the focal point is Agenda 2063. So the question is, why is it that that you don't have an African affairs constituency in the U.S. for Agenda 2063, or Africans focusing on this is what Africa wants the U.S. and other external actors to focus on, and then with the African Continental Free Trade Area prioritizing regional and continental integration. So this is sort of, I think that the way Nigerians and Kenyans look at Trump is almost beside the point. But it does raise the question of where we are in terms of how Africans relate to the U.S. and vice versa.
Thank you. I think while we were having this discussion, there's a question that came in, and from Rose, in fact. And the question, I think you can see it in the chat, but let me just read it for the benefit of everybody. And the question is it possible that Africans in the diaspora may be in favor of Trump due to his homophobic and xenophobic attitudes towards immigrant people? That's the question. I guess you can also read it in the chat, the panelists. And let's start maybe with Brooks. Or Brooks, do you have a point on that?
Let me respond to it this way. While we were doing our conversations, I tried desperately to find some more detailed breakdowns of attitudes toward or against Donald Trump among other countries. The one thing that leapt out at me was, and I'll get back to the specifics of the question in a sec. The thing that leapt out at me was it depended a great deal on where on the political spectrum you were in your own country. If you were a Slovakian right-winger, for example, you were markedly more favorably inclined toward Donald Trump than if you were a socialist. And this was true all the charts. It was true pretty uniformly throughout all the places I could quickly Google. With respect to the questions, the points in the question, it is possible that people who have conservative social values, whether they are African expatriates living in the United States or citizens who are of recent African origin, to the extent that they have socially conservative values, that's shorthand for the kinds of things the question talks to, is perhaps indicative of the level of enthusiasm or support, or at the minimum, respect for Donald Trump. To the extent to which you don't have that set of attitudes is the extent to which necessarily you think that much less of him, that much less of his policies, and are much less likely to support him in any way. Can I just add one other little thing as we're talking about the support for Donald Trump in the U.S. as it expresses itself in social behavior by people. None of the survey data shows that the Republican National Convention gave any popular rise to Donald Trump's popularity among Americans writ large. In fact, it was effectively neutral, which means that it is entirely possible that he has not been able to nudge the dial any further over towards support. And if that's true, then the national surveys that say he is consistently behind Joe Biden in support nationally are an accurate reflection of the trend line for American approaches to Donald Trump as well. I think I'll close it off there.
Thanks, Brooks. And I think the same question to any one of us, John, Francis, Dr. Small, if you'd like to respond to this question on why the diaspora may be in favor of Trump. The suggestion here being it might be due to his homophobic and xenophobic attitude. Sure.
Yeah, let me just say this. I'm not sure that I think we have to make a differentiation there. I'm not sure that that the diaspora writ large is in favor of Donald Trump at all. Now, I mean, I don't know that one can conflate, can automatically conflate polling of Nigerian and Kenyan attitudes towards the fact that there is a diaspora favorability. So that just is not very clear at all. And I think it would relate more to what Brooks has just raised in terms of social and cultural tendencies in terms of how one looks at these kinds of issues. The problem is that, you know, more often than not, except for those of us who are real aficionados on foreign policy and political matters, a lot of people are really not that clued into politics as such. So it's difficult to make any definitive assumptions or about whether, you know, people are favorable one way or the other. You know, so I think that's what I would say on that.
Okay, I think Professor Stremlau, any perspectives on this?
I would agree with Francis. I would like to take the conversation perhaps a little more into the contingencies that might lie ahead that I think African governments are watching very closely, and that is, first of all, the decision by the Trump campaign, it appears, to concentrate on these key Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, where they do think they can mobilize reaction to the Black Lives Movement and to the cause of racial justice on the part of those at the lower end of the white Christian specter that voted for him in 2016. And there is always this question that looms in the discourse about the hidden vote that Trump will get by people who are too embarrassed to tell pollsters that they will vote for him. I don't think that's anywhere like what happened, perhaps from the polling data after the 2016 election, but it does raise questions about the likelihood of the process being consolidated around electoral victory for Biden and for Harris. I can easily see Trump, who has denigrated the integrity of the election, as I mentioned before, on the election night, declaring himself the winner on the early poll results before we get mailed-in ballots, and creating effectively a constitutional crisis by contending that he's been elected and maybe even getting his court justices to go ahead and support it. So Biden has a much harder task ahead he's got to win the Electoral College significantly, and he's got to win in the popular vote significantly. That second is pretty easy. But bear in mind that it was only 70,000 votes or so that in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania that gave Donald Trump the 304 to 227 margin in the Electoral College, which is another reason we need to talk about the Electoral College going forward in this series, because it is so peculiar and so rooted in the history of racism in America, as Francis knows better than I, back to the founding of the Republic. But I do think that it's helpful to have a perspective on this election that is recognizing that it's a 330 million country, and the African population, both immigrant and indigenous or ex-slave, the descendants of slaves, is still only 13% of the population. And so you've got to figure out a way, and Biden and Harris are trying to do that, to broaden the base. And I was encouraged by the Black Lives Matter movement, initially seeing the multiracial nature of that movement, which I think was a sea change in the dynamics, political dynamics of America, but we don't know quite where that stands right now.
Thanks, John. And I want us to move to Dr. Small, and I wanted actually specifically perhaps to have you respond to that question, but also touch a bit on the point you raised earlier of electoral violence, even though you later on suggested it's not on any scale that we see in Africa. But to what extent, or what are the implications, what are the impacts of this violence on the elections? Are there on the continent and elsewhere? Maybe to just go back to that, even as you answer this specific question, Dr. Small.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, I think in relation to Rose's question, I think there are two intersecting and interdependent moments that came around. The first is what was pegged as this global crisis in migration. You know, following Arab uprisings, broadly what we've seen in Africa as post-colonial migration, but you've had a lot of people moving. So anti-immigrant sentiment is shared across countries. It's spiked in a number of countries as more people moving has intersected with economic declines or economic recessions. And of course, what will that mean in the context of COVID-19? That will remain to be seen. But this xenophobic sentiment is not unique, you know, to Trump or to his politicking. It happens in Africa. I mean, South Africa has seen some of the worst xenophobic violence. So, you know, is it about Africans being in favor of Trump due to this? No, I think Africans have their own views on this based on their particular base views, and the fact that politicians have used this as a tactic, you know, to create support bases and to foment power. Orban, Modi, Bolsonaro, John, you know, we can go on. And in Africa, it's about the distribution of resources, finite resources. So, Rose, I don't really know if that answers your question about the African diaspora, but just to, you know, highlight the point that we have those challenges within our own countries. And then, Bob, to come to your question about the implications of this violence. Whether Biden wins, whether Trump wins, I think violence will have a hangover in the US system. What has been unleashed is this interactional violence amongst civilians that is seated in deep divides over race, injustice, inequality. And you can't put that back, right? You can't just put that in the box, say the election's over and move on. So I think the violence will have a hangover, and unless those issues are addressed, the violence will continue in one form or another. I think dangerously, if, you know, the violence is not put to the feet of where it has been orchestrated. So if there's no sort of investigation and very unlikely prosecution of this as an electoral offense, inciting violence, you know, for people who stand behind Trump, and there is a large Republican base behind Trump, he's not just standing alone, they've seen how you can call upon this base level of white nationalism. And I think that's a very dangerous trend. Implications are also quite worrying for institutions. If people have lost faith in institutions to mediate their differences, to settle their differences, and are relying on taking differences to the streets, well, it's eroded the legitimacy of those institutions. But how do you get the legitimacy and integrity of those institutions back? So I think, you know, those are just some of the immediate challenges that will have to be dealt with, whoever wins. Trump, of course, won't deal with those challenges. I think those challenges will become deeper. And, you know, Francis talks about this racial fascism that will really have grave implications for democratic institutions in the US.
Thanks, Dr. Small. I think those are very interesting observations. But coming now to Brooks, I posed this question of what would be your thoughts on the place of religion in these elections? We speak of the Christian vote and you know, the fundamentalism there and so forth. What's your take on this large constituency called religion?
Religion, yes. Let's start with the first and probably the most important issue in religion is the largely white Christian evangelical fundamentalist born-again sector of the American population, somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 to 40 million votes there. That's a lot of votes. Now, obviously, they don't all vote, and not every single one of them lines up uniformly behind Donald Trump or behind what a pastor may or may not say. But consistently in the last several elections, they have, as a group, largely been supportive of Republican candidates. And really the only place where it was difficult for them was when Mitt Romney was running, because he was, after all, a Mormon, which is not something that the evangelical fundamentalist world tends to hold in the highest possible regard. So let's assume that much of what the Trump rhetoric speaks to is the kind of thing that is presumed to resonate positively with that base of support. By contrast, the Black Christian vote, now there are obviously some people who are Black and not Christian, but the Black Christian vote, mostly Methodist Baptists, have tended over time to be solidly in the Democratic corner and have voted consistently for Democratic candidates. Now, if we then take Jewish Americans, the survey data that I have seen on it says that consistently since Franklin Roosevelt ran and won for the presidency, the percentage of American Jews who vote for Democratic candidates somewhere between 85 and 90% of the total of their votes. Now, it's a much smaller vote total, of course, just a couple of millions. And when attitudes on that group are pursued, support for Israel is down somewhere about the number 5th or number 6th item on the list. Social economic issues are always higher, except perhaps for that much smaller portion of American Jews who have voted for Republicans. As a result, religion theoretically is not supposed to be part of the American electoral canvas, but in practical terms, it has real impact on the way people have lined up to vote over time, and presumably in this year's election as well. One of the things that is crucial perhaps to watch in the next couple of months is the extent to which white Christian evangelical born again Americans begin to desert in some way, at some level, the Trump campaign and the Trump candidacy, and most especially in states where the swings of just a few tens of thousands of votes is the difference between winning and losing that state: Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, maybe even Arizona. And I think that's probably a good place to start and to think about it, and maybe enough to stop from my comments right now.
Thanks, Brooks. That's quite insightful. And we'd like to welcome Francis back. And Francis, while you went off a bit, we were discussing the place and role of religion in these elections. And I think we'll come back to you. We'll come to you for your comment on that. But for now, let's listen to Professor Stremlau on the same question of religion in the elections.
I am a bit confused by the fact that the fundamentalist Christians have overlooked Donald Trump's womanizing, lying, family abuse, lack of any kind of values, in order to enlist his support on abortion, LGBT issues, even though, my goodness, he is, as I assume, he doesn't care about LGBT issues, and generally his anti-elite feelings that seem to be attractive to them. I think that may be cracking a bit, but I don't know. And I thought Brooks gave a nice overview of the various strains of religion in America. But it is a very important factor and always has been in elections. I'm recalling the most devout president we probably had in recent times, which is Jimmy Carter. And he said he had to come to terms as a boy with not only the fact that his state supported segregation and racism, and his father did, but he also had to learn about racial superiority in his church. And so you realize how profoundly ingrained this is, and this gets back to the violence. And I just want to say one word about the violence, because it's so endemic to American culture, born of the need to suppress slavery, and the so-called Second Amendment that everybody talks about, that allows 300 million guns to circulate in American society, is basically a Southern demand for a militia so that they could suppress slaves and be sure that they had an order where they didn't have an army. And you go round and round on this constantly. So in that sense, Biden and Harris are stirring up some of the really basics, but they can't stir up too much too soon, because it is so pervasive. Structural racism is so pervasive. It is the core of the republic, and that has to be come to terms with. That's why this is an inflection moment, as I say. Anyway, that's a bit of a digression.
No, thank you. I think those are interesting perspectives as well. So I think I'd like to bring in Dr. Small, if you have any perspectives on the religion card in this election.
As an atheist, Bob, I have a very limited insight on the role of religions or religious thinkers. So I think I will wait till the next round of questions on what a Biden or Trump win could mean.
Certainly, and I think that is well appreciated. Francis? Unmute, Francis. You are mute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now. Sure. Proceed. But you're mute now. You're mute again.
What's going on?
Now you're on now.
Okay. Okay. Two things briefly. One point is that when it comes around to Biden, his Catholicism is a very important dimension in terms of how he resonates in the battleground states, particularly in Pennsylvania, given his Irish Catholic background. So that's something that may play in his favor in spite of the issues that tend to alienate Catholics in terms of Democrats on abortion and the like. Now the other thing, and I'm wondering if anyone has been following what has been happening with Jerry Falwell. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can. Proceed. Now, but now you're mute. I think you typed something there.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Now, there's this major controversy involving Jerry Falwell, which I'm not going to go into the details of it, but I mean, it's a big scandal that I think illuminates a lot of the contradictions and hypocrisies among evangelicals that tends to surface now and then. So it's not. I mean, it's not surprising that they are stuck on Trump. I mean, Trump is for some of the political agenda that they have in terms of abortion and the like. Combined with the National Rifle Association, and all of that, they are willing to support him. The fact that he is hardly, one who for which religion is very important. I think that does not really influence them, given their own contradictions and hypocrisies reflected in some of the scandals that periodically surface, such as what is going on right now with Jerry Falwell.
Right.
Bobby, Francis should identify Falwell a little bit more. His father was a very prominent evangelical and had a huge following. And the younger Falwell, who's now in the scandal, runs Liberty University, which is a huge fundamentalist university in the South that has been very prominent. But the hypocrisy that Francis is alluding to, no segment of the society has a monopoly on hypocrisy. But I do think that one other point about Joe Biden that maybe African viewers wouldn't understand the importance of. Not only is his character a strong argument in his favor, and his family values and his religion, but he would be the second Catholic in the 46 presidents that have served America since 1789. So that, in a sense, is a break. Kennedy is the other one, and of course Kamala Harris is a major advance for a country. If it's going to ever be united in its diversity, not only a home for all who live there, but united in its diversity, it's going to take this kind of leadership to make that acceptable to the majority. And that's the real challenge that now confronts this inflection moment, is to make that tolerance mainstream in a country which, to go back to the violence that Michelle has been so eloquent on, is at the heart of the suppression in the South. It was a war on terror from the end of the Civil War until the civil rights legislation, but it still continues in various forms, as Francis and others know. And that's at the heart of the violence in the Republic, it seems to me. The lynchings and the Jim Crow suppression was so violent, and then it spilled up into the North and the police actions in the urban segregated cities. So again, this is the story of America that is only recently becoming mainstream history in school texts and in discourse. I mean, I think Francis could comment on how historic this change of the discourse is on the lost cause strategy in the South, and that all of that has been at least opened up now.
Right. Thanks for that very insightful as well addition. And I think now this actually now takes us towards the last half hour of our discussion. I thought perhaps we could use the remaining time to discuss a little Trump or a Biden win. Just to repeat, if my internet is low, as I can see on my screen, I thought that we will. I thought that we would perhaps discuss the real chances of Trump or Biden winning and the implications thereof as we go towards the end. And I think starting with, I wonder if Gilbert, do you have any note on that? No. Then so let's go to Brooks then.
Okay, I think I heard all of your question, and please correct me if I didn't hear it properly. I'm supposed to address the actual chances of a win by either of the two major party candidates, and why I think that's going to be the way it is going to come out. Is that correct?
That is correct, but in addition, the question of the implications of either win.
Implications for just generally speaking.
If Trump wins.
Okay.
Generally speaking, yes.
If the polls are accurate, and I always issue this as a footnote. Polls are not predictive; they're snapshots. They're snapshots at any given time, and they're snapshots by about 10 different cameras from slightly different angles. So you always have to look at them grouped together and get the sense of it. It seems clear at this point, absent one of those major gaffes or some other major problem, it looks like this election is Joe Biden's to lose. It will depend enormously on how well he performs in those battleground swing states in the same old list: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, perhaps Arizona. And if that's the case, what we have is the possibility, because of so many more votes being cast by mail-in ballots this year, and the likelihood there won't be a nice, crisp decision at 11 o'clock at night on the 3rd that Joe Biden wins or Joe Biden concedes, it's going to open up the gates for all kinds of claims and counterclaims and pushes to recount. And as a result, the best outcome is a decisive victory by a candidate at this point, so that we don't have what happened in the year 2000 extending across all 50 states. Let's take the assumption that Donald Trump wins, and he wins in a disputed way and with much anxiety and much anger and frustration, but he wins, and whatever court cases there are lead to that conclusion as well. What you don't see is much in the way of policy changes, because I don't actually think there are Donald Trump policies. I think there are Donald Trump attitudes and there are Donald Trump instincts, but I don't see policies. What you have is what will work best for me for support at any given moment. Just take, for example, a fairly arcane idea that is likely to be the case, that there will be a payroll tax halt for the next number of months. Payroll tax is the money that's paid for Social Security, which is roughly the same as retirement pensions in most countries. What that will mean is that people will see a slightly bigger bump in their paychecks, but then come the new year, there's going to be a lot more money that they're going to have to pay. That's going to have a negative impact. And then, of course, there'll be some way to deal with that. What you will see in public health areas, of course, is there will be much flapping about, much incoherent policy making, and the death toll will rise and rise. It will cross past 200,000 and bump into 300,000, and there'll be much national catharsis over that. But I don't see, for example, that Donald Trump would be able to articulate a coherent set of policies, either domestically or internationally, that you can put your finger on easily and say, in the second term, he will do the following things. He'll simply do what in the second term, what he did in the first term, only more nastily, I think is fair to say. If Joe Biden wins, you will see a desperate effort to return to the Obama-style normality of things. You will see an effort to return to a more cooperative international process with traditional allies. You will see, presumably, a response toward outrages by Russia or China or whoever it might be that is dealt with not unilaterally, but in a multilateral kind of way. But let me add the really important footnote in all of this. It's going to depend a great deal. You remember right at the beginning, I mentioned there are all these other elections that matter, and several of your panelists said, yes, that's important. You're going to, if the Senate remains in Republican hands, Joe Biden will be hamstrung. He will be Gulliver, tied down by those silken threads of the Lilliputians and unable to break free until he gets somebody to agree to help him. If the Democrats win 4, 5 seats more in the Senate, it becomes a different ballgame. But the finances of the country are still stressed, and they are still going to be stressed sufficiently that major initiatives in government spending are going to be very hard to come by.
Thank you. Thank you, Brooks. I think that's very interesting perspectives there. And now we move to Professor Stremlau. I think my internet is low again, but I was just saying, Professor Stremlau, it's your chance to also weigh in on the same question.
Let me give a shout out for next week, Bob, because you'll have Melitzi and Becky on the panel, and I think it would be helpful in anticipation of this being an election for Biden and Harris to lose. We could see scenarios that might allow Donald Trump to continue, in which case I wouldn't think policy planning in Africa would waste much time on trying to alter his behavior. But Melitzi knows and was the ANC representative for information, leading the information effort at the height of the anti-apartheid movement, and knows the Congress very well and what it took to get that political support. And I think really what African governments should be doing is to thinking about contingencies in the event of a Biden-Harris ticket. And in that connection, again next week, you'll have Johnny Carson, who was Assistant Secretary under Obama and was very much at the forefront in organizing the recent Africa policy discussion about the Biden candidacy with Whitney Schneidman and Linda Thomas Greenfield. They organized it. Two former assistant secretaries and one deputy assistant secretary for African Affairs. Susan Rice, who is the likely, one of the likely candidates for the state, made very plain that she thought you could have a broad initiative that would reach out to cooperate with Africa that didn't cost a lot of money, but they are going to emphasize, and Carson will, I think, next week, democracy and human rights and partnerships that are broader based than just bilateral programs, because money is going to be very tight. But a lot of these programs are very popular, as I mentioned earlier, like PEPFAR and AGOA and with the Congress and YALI. And I don't think there'll be any big initiatives new, but I do think that you'd see a warming of relations, a building of broader bases of networks between them, because the message coming out of the African advisors to Biden, and Biden does owe his nomination and ultimately now his presidency to Jim Clyburn and the South Carolinian African American community, that I think there will be leverage there that African governments ought to be planning for now, and figuring out ways that they would ignite their networks, whether they're with their kith and kin, the immigrant population, or with favorite congressmen who pay attention to Africa. This is a historic opportunity for African-U.S. Revival of cooperation, at least to overcome the lost years of the Trump administration, if that's the case.
Thanks, Professor Stremlau. Thank you. And I think to Michelle now, Dr. Small, on the same question of implications. Yeah.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, I think whether it's a Biden win, whether it's a Trump win, I think both are going to have turning points. With Biden, in the short term, we kind of predict that Trump will not accept the result. He will, if not directly contested, he will grumble about it. And given his supporter base, what we will see is retaliatory pro-Trump violence. But with a Biden win, there is a lot of work to be done. There is going to be much needed trust and confidence building, restructuring of institutions, retraining of police and law and order officials, you know, and even taking on the electoral system in terms of this disenfranchisement, which is a very hard thing to do because it's, as Prof has talked to me so much, it's rooted in the Constitution and, you know, in law. But if this is going to be a turning point, that's the work that needs to be done, or else those fault lines will always be there. A Trump win, well, it will be a turning point in the sense that what you will see is more racialized violence. I think the violence will amp up. You will also see more of the same in terms of denigration of institutions, the racial fascism that Francis alluded to, and more of the defying of science, defying of fact. But the turning point will come in terms of a Trump win for civil society. I think civil society organizations, civilians themselves, voters themselves, will realize the work that needs to be done is then not going to be realized in street battles. Yeah, so I think both will result in turning points, but to different degrees in the short term and in the long term.
Right. I think it's quite interesting, the whole idea of, you know, Professor Stremlau mentioned earlier, the whole idea of inflection points. And now Michelle, you're bringing in the concept or idea of turning points in the two tickets. And this actually can constitute a very interesting area of research and publication, in fact, on what are the, what's new, what's going to be new, what's going to be the departure points for the both you know, at the elections. And on that note, I think let's bring in Francis.
Yeah.
Francis.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Okay. Well, first of all, let me tell you my concern. You know, like you know, Brooks, in terms of the polls and so forth. You know, the Biden should win the election. It is Biden and Harris's to lose. The problem that I have, though, is that much depends on turnout, because even though Biden and Harris are leading nationally and in many of the swing states, it's going to be about turnout. And one of the concerns that I have in the battleground states in the Rust Belt, Pennsylvania, Michigan, well, not so much Michigan, but Wisconsin and Minnesota, is that the polls are closer than what you get in the national. So, you know, one just has to hope for the best in that regard. The other thing, though, is that one has to look at scenarios. For example, let's say Trump wins, but the Democrats take the Senate, and you have a Congress under the Democrats. Then you're going to have a very interesting situation, and you might even be looking at another impeachment. Biden, however, if Biden and Harris win, you know, I agree with Brooks's assessment. Unless they carry the Senate too, he's going to have a problem. In spite of Biden's touting himself as being able to work with Republicans, because we're no longer in the age of bipartisanship. And if you're going to continue with Mitch McConnell as Senate Majority Leader, then I mean it's going to be simply more hardball. As far as implications for Africa, you know, on the assumption that that Biden and Harris may pull it out, even in the end, I think it would be good. It'd be smart for African governments to begin making a beeline to Clyburn, because I mean Clyburn, given his leadership position in the House, and with Biden, he's going to be a very, very important person to have in one's corner in terms of advancing one's agenda. The last point I want to make has to do with how much stress there is on the budget, which is obviously under stress, a lot of stress. But what this is going to mean, that that Biden is going to have to make some very, very difficult decisions. The military budget, which has tended to be sacrosanct, is going to have to come under some is going to have to be cut in order to if Biden wants to implement his FDR plus, New Deal plus, he's going to have to both cut the military budget and rescind tax cuts that Trump has come out with. The thing is that the Democrats really have very little choice in terms of what they have, the expectations that they've raised, the pressure. I mean, the pressure is so great in terms of addressing domestic backlogs that have not been dealt with, infrastructure, you name it. And the coronavirus has just added more pressure to it. So this means that the budgeting for defense and foreign policy is going to require new thinking in terms of strategy. And now, I would agree with John and so forth. I don't think that I would not think within that context that there would necessarily have to be major cuts in African programs. But I do think that there has to be a new template in terms of Africa policy. With that, I think I'll end my remarks on that.
Can I make a quick point about this, Bob, because we're missing one element in the last analysis before we close, and that is democracy depends on the consent of the loser. And Trump is sending out all these signals he's not going to accept the results. Let us not forget that he's exposed legally to a lot of possibilities of penalties and even convictions and going to jail for a host of issues in the Southern District of New York and elsewhere. Biden is going to have a lot of leverage in getting a solution, just as African leaders who lose and incumbents particularly have had to be talked into having distinguished post-presidency careers and not make themselves a problem. It's not easy to do, and Trump will not take this deal easily, but I think there will have to be some sort of a deal, and that will allow him to concede because he has legal exposure.
Good point.
Right. Thanks, Professor Stremlau. And I think now with only a couple of minutes left, we want to go towards the end of today's session. I will ask each one of us to spend a minute or so to do our closing remarks, beginning with Brooks.
Okay, three things actually. As we look forward into the coming into the election, the thing that we have not discussed much about when we talk about African reactions or policy toward Africa is what are African nations going to do with whoever is in office come January 2021. And the thing that startles me is there has been virtually no discussion on this continent that I've seen of the end of the African Growth and Opportunity Act duty-free entry procedures for African products. And if my memory is correct, John may remember better than me, the average trade negotiation, now AGOA was not a trade negotiation, but the average trade negotiation between the US and a country or a group of countries takes around 7 years to complete, which means if there was going to be a push for further trade liberalization between the US and Africa, it should have started about 2 or 3 years ago. And I see no evidence that any of this is happening. And I think more than aid, more than even investment, trade is going to be the crucial issue for the future. And I don't see nearly enough effort or energy devoted toward that. The second point is that even if Joe Biden were to win the election, and if people on this continent expect the second coming, they shouldn't. There was great excitement when Barack Obama won his election at first, that he was the president for Africa. And I kept reminding people, no, he's an African American who's president of the United States, but who has ancestors on the continent. And his first order of business is American interests and American security. And so we need to keep the jubilation down to a sort of a modest level. And the third point, which reflects something my wife sent me a little not quite love note about, I should clarify that of all the people wandering into my house over the last number of months talking about Donald Trump, it's primarily been the service providers who come to fix things, who have expressed a certain amount of qualified appreciation for him rather than neighbors, friends, and relatives. Let's leave it at that. But this has been an interesting discussion for me, and I take a number of useful points forward for myself when I write further on this topic.
Thank you, John.
I don't think I better add anything further, Bob. I'm with Brooks on that.
All right, Dr. Small.
Thanks, Bob. I think the only thing I would add is that we need the inflection point that Prof. Stremlau has spoken about, not only for the US, but for Africa and the world. With the rise of populist politics, rising intolerism, militarism, violence, across political governance and underpinning political governance in the past decade. We need something that is going to reverse that wave. And so I'm hopeful that it will be the US election, which is the example of what could go right or what could go wrong.
Right. That speaks obviously to the fact that the US is a superpower, and what happens there has ramifications across the world. And so let's have Francis also chime in with his closing remarks.
Yeah, I want to reinforce the point that Brooks raised about trade. I think particularly with the African Continental Free Trade area coming on stream, the continent really needs to become more proactive on the trade front in terms of the future of AGOA and how you transition from AGOA into a relationship between the U.S. and the Continental Free Trade area, and that's going to be a very complex kettle of fish to deal with. But overall, I think it also brings up the fact that rather than Africans, if Biden is elected, getting their hopes up, Africa has to take the initiative in dictating what kind of policies that it sees that it wants to have from the U.S., but also from other external actors, the EU and whatever. I mean, the thing is that African reactions to the U.S. and other external actors tends to be reactive rather than proactive. And I think given the age that we're getting in, that has to be that has to be turned around. The other thing is that the inflection point, if Biden and Harris do win, is that there will be more focus on internal renewal in the U.S. and less focus on on the international on America's international engagements. But that's going to have to be done in a way that that really balances and redresses the problems that that Trump has gotten the U.S. into. If Trump is elected, well, I think it'll just be more of the same and worse. and I'll just end on that note.
Thank you. And on that note, I think unless anybody on the panel has any further point or issue to raise, I think we come to the end of today's session. It was very wide-ranging as we had crafted it, because we thought we'll touch on various issues that are not necessarily thematically coherent, but touch on the various key points, key issues in this election. In the session next week, as Professor Stremlau alluded to, we are going to be joined by Mr. Moelet Mbeki, who is a well-known commentator on these issues, as well as former Assistant Secretary of State to Africa, Mr. Johnny Carson, and they will be paired, or also on the panel will be Professor Stremlau and Francis Kornegay, and we shall be discussing African policy towards the US policy towards Africa as one point, and then also touch on issues to do with race and identity in this year's elections. In the session on the 18th, so that you just get to know what is coming ahead, we shall then turn to issues that Dr. Small mentioned today or touched on, things to do with violence, extremism, terrorism, and issues like that as we see them from the point of view of these elections. And then we'll move on the session on 25th. We'll focus more on issues close to Brook Spector's heart, which is issues to do with media and journalism. And for that occasion, we are glad, we are happy that we shall be having on board Professor Anton Haber and a few other journalism colleagues from other parts of the continent. And so I think that is the lay of the ground for the next couple of sessions. And I think since I see David Monyae in the audience, I just wanted to mention that sometime in October, probably the first week of October, we shall have a big session on the geopolitical dimensions of these elections, where for Africa will feature. And with those few remarks, let me not tire you any further, just to say thank you, and we'll see you next time.